The air hangs thick with the promise of doom. But to understand the terror, we must first appreciate the blinding height from which England was about to fall. Imagine the year 1422. The name Henry V echoes across Europe, a beacon of chivalry and battlefield genius. He had crushed the French at Agincourt, not just winning a battle, but winning the right to the French throne itself. He was the warrior king, the shepherd of his people, the man who united a fractious nobility through sheer force of will and victory. He was the embodiment of perfection. He had married Catherine of Valois, linking the crowns of England and France, and securing a future dynasty that promised absolute global dominance. It felt like the dawn of an eternal empire. But destiny, that cruel, invisible executioner, had other plans hidden just beneath the gilded surface. Henry V, the Magnificent, was stolen by dysentery, a simple, ignoble stomach ailment, at the age of just 35. The shockwave that rattled Europe was nothing compared to the seismic terror that gripped the English court. He left behind a wife and, crucially, a 9-month-old infant son, Henry VI. 9 months old. Think about that vulnerability. The Sun King was dead, and in his place sat a baby who could barely recognize a rattle, let alone the weight of 2 crowns. This wasn't a transition of power. It was a vacuum, screaming to be filled by the most ambitious and ruthless men in the kingdom. The great house of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, carried a fatal genetic flaw. Henry VI inherited not the iron will of his father, but the terrifying mental instability of his maternal grandfather, Charles VI of France, known chillingly as Charles the Mad. This hidden ticking clock of madness was the real enemy of England. While the nobility argued over land and titles, the boy king grew up timid, overly pious, and crucially, completely incapable of making decisive decisions or controlling the vicious barons swirling around him. He was a saint, perhaps, but a disastrous king. The royal treasury was hemorrhaging money on failed French campaigns, managed by incompetent and warring counselors. The great territorial magnates, men like the Duke of York, the Duke of Somerset, and the terrifying Earl of Warwick, the future kingmaker, were growing restless. They looked at the soft, prayerful king and saw not their sovereign, but a weakness to exploit. The core of the issue lay in the simple fact that Henry V's line, the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenets, had usurped the throne back in 1399 when Henry IV deposed Richard II. That usurpation had never been truly settled. It was a ghost whispering in the halls of power, waiting for a strong claimant to give it voice. That strong claimant would be Richard, Duke of York. He was immensely wealthy, a proven military commander, and critically, he had a superior hereditary claim to the throne than Henry VI. He was descended from Lionel of Antwerp, an elder son of Edward III, while the Lancastrians were descended from John of Gaunt, a younger son. The legal argument was sound, but the political reality was deadly. For years, Richard of York acted as the dutiful servant, the loyal cousin, but the humiliations piled up. He was constantly undermined by Henry VI's favorites, particularly the arrogant Duke of Somerset. When a king is weak, the realm descends into factional warfare, and soon the political maneuvering turned into open, violent hostility. The breaking point came not with a battle, but with the catastrophic failure of the king's mind. In the summer of 1453, Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. He slipped into a catatonic state, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to recognize his own wife, Queen Margaret of Anjou, or even the newborn son who was supposed to secure the dynasty. He was, effectively, a living corpse on the throne. The lords were stunned. The Queen was terrified. But Richard of York saw his moment. Parliament was forced to appoint a protector to govern the realm while the king was indisposed. And who else could step into that role of ultimate power, the role of regent, but the Duke of York himself? York seized the opportunity, locking up his bitter rival, Somerset, and consolidating his power. This was not yet war, but the fuse had been lit. The two greatest families in England, Lancaster, Red Rose, and York, White Rose, were now polarized, their political battle lines drawn in the deepest, most unforgiving shade of hatred. But the horror was far from over, because in Christmas Day 1454, a miracle, or perhaps a curse, occurred. King Henry VI suddenly, miraculously woke up. He had no memory of the 18 months he had lost, immediately reversed every single decision Richard of York had made, and freed the Duke of Somerset. York was stripped of his power, humiliated and exiled from court. He knew, deep in his bones, that to save himself, he could no longer rely on political petition. He needed soldiers, he needed blood, and he needed to settle the argument of 1399 once and for all. The sleeping giant of civil war was awake, and the first devastating drops of blood were about to be spilled on the cobblestones of St. Albans. We left off staring into the abyss, but to truly understand the horror that followed, we must understand the man who held the scepter. Henry VI, the son of the lion, was, tragically, a lamb, a king born to inherit the greatest military legacy in England's history, but cursed with a soul meant for a monastery. He was gentle, he was pious, and he was utterly, catastrophically unfit to rule a pack of hungry wolves disguised as nobles. While his father's ghost still haunted the battlements of France, Henry VI allowed the hard-won empire to simply melt away, piece by agonizing piece. He valued prayer and scholarship over strategy and steel, a virtue in a priest, but a deadly vice in a medieval monarch. His government quickly devolved into a den of corruption, ruled by favorites who understood only one thing: how to enrich themselves while alienating the powerful magnates of the realm. The nobility watched with a mixture of horror and growing opportunity as the golden crown of England was rusted by incompetence. This catastrophic inadequacy left a gaping void in the heart of the monarchy, and nature, history's most unforgiving force, abhors a vacuum. Into this power chasm stepped a figure of unparalleled ferocity, Margaret of Anjou. She was French, she was proud, and she viewed the English court not as her refuge, but as a territory to be defended with tooth and nail against the vultures circling her weak husband. The moment she arrived, she understood the deep, corrosive threat that lurked within the king's own bloodline: Richard, Duke of York. Margaret was the steel Henry lacked. She was intelligent, politically astute, and fiercely protective of her husband's rights, which meant she was equally fierce in her hatred of anyone who dared question the Lancastrian legitimacy. She was the fire that would sustain the House of Lancaster, but also the blaze that would scorch England. The pressure cooker began to hiss loudest after 1453. After decades of costly warfare, the last great French foothold, Bordeaux, fell. The glorious legacy of Agincourt, the dream of Henry V, was extinguished, resulting in national humiliation on an epic scale. The nobles were disgraced, the soldiers were unpaid, and the common people were taxed into poverty to fund a war that was now definitively lost. The blame had to land somewhere, and it landed squarely on Henry VI's disastrous inner circle, the Duke of Suffolk and, critically, the Duke of Somerset. These men, the king's closest advisors, were seen as the authors of defeat in France and the architects of the financial ruin at home. The fury boiled over in 1450 with Jack Cade's rebellion, where thousands of commoners marched on London demanding justice and the removal of the traitors. York was not some distant cousin seeking an opportunistic grab. Through his mother, Anne Mortimer, he had a superior hereditary claim to the throne than the Lancastrians, tracing his lineage back to Edward III's second son, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, while Lancaster descended from the third, John of Gaunt. This genetic advantage was coupled with political strength. He was a natural leader, a successful governor in Ireland and France, and, crucially, he was seen as the patriotic alternative to the corrupt clique destroying England from within. The people didn't just want him to rule, they demanded he be given the reins of power to restore order. But Margaret knew that giving York power meant inviting a viper into the royal bedchamber, a viper who wore the white rose of inevitable revolution. Then the ultimate historical irony struck. In August 1453, as news of the final defeat in France settled over the court, Henry VI suffered the most profound nervous breakdown in English history. He fell into a catatonic state, unable to speak, to recognize his wife, or even to acknowledge the birth of his own son, Edward. For 18 harrowing months, the King of England was a living ghost, a breathing statue, utterly incapable of signing a document or issuing a command. The country was adrift, legally and politically rudderless. The Queen, Margaret, fought desperately to maintain control, arguing she should rule as regent in her husband's name, especially now that she had produced a male heir, a huge development that threatened York's position. But the Lords refused to grant a French woman, lacking English noble support, the ultimate power over the realm. They needed a protector, a strong hand to steady the ship while the king remained lost in his own mind. In 1454, the inevitable happened. The Lords declared Richard, Duke of York, the protector of the realm and chief counselor. This was not a military coup. This was a reluctant constitutional necessity, authorized by Parliament, but it sealed the fate of thousands. York immediately began to clean house, removing his great rival, the Duke of Somerset, throwing him into the Tower, and stabilizing the economy. He proved himself an excellent ruler, efficient and popular, which, paradoxically, only magnified the danger he posed to the Lancastrian line. He tasted true power and found it sweeter than he expected. But history, always waiting to twist the knife, delivered a cruel blow to York's triumph. On Christmas Day, 1454, Henry VI woke up. The catatonia vanished as suddenly as it had arrived, almost like a switch had been flipped. Henry VI, bewildered but recognized his queen, and Margaret, seeing her chance to undo the damage, immediately took command of the now conscious king. Every single reform York had implemented was instantly reversed. Somerset was freed from the Tower, and York was summarily stripped of his power, sent back to his estates, effectively disgraced and marked for destruction. This was the moment Richard of York realized the game of politics was over. He knew that to retreat meant death, for Margaret would never forgive his protectorate and the imprisonment of her allies. The only way forward was to defend himself, and the only way to defend himself was to fight for what he believed was his right, and what many believed was England's survival. The uneasy peace shattered. York raised his banners, claiming he was simply marching to remove the villainous Somerset from the king's presence, a classic feudal justification for treason. But everyone knew the truth. The White Rose was marching toward London to seize the man who wore the red. The clash was unavoidable. The first drop of noble blood was about to fall, not on some distant French field, but in the heart of England itself, right outside the town of St. Albans. The true storm was about to break. The silence that had settled over England after York's brief protectorate was not peace. It was merely the awful stillness before a catastrophic collapse. For 15 terrifying months, Richard of York had held the reins of power, while Henry VI was lost in the swirling fog of mental incapacity, bringing a fragile, fleeting order to a realm that desperately needed it. But then, on Christmas Day, 1454, the miracle happened. Or perhaps the curse was lifted, and Henry VI awoke, lucid and aware. The king was instantly briefed by his fiercely protective queen, Margaret of Anjou, who whispered bitter truths about the man who had dared to rule in his stead. She saw York not as a loyal kinsman, but as the serpent who threatened her son's inheritance, and she struck with the predatory speed of a coiled viper. York was immediately stripped of the protectorate, his reforms dismantled, and his closest allies marginalized and exiled from court. This was not merely a political reversal. This was the ignition of a blood feud that had simmered for years, driven by the intense, mortal hatred between Richard of York and the newly empowered Duke of Somerset. Queen Margaret, wielding the recovered king like a weapon, recalled Somerset and other staunch Lancastrian loyalists, stacking the government with men committed to York's destruction. The final, chilling move came in the spring of 1455, a summons for a great council, ostensibly to discuss the state of the realm, but suspiciously called far away in Leicester, deep in Lancastrian territory. York, along with his formidable allies, the Earls of Salisbury and the young, tempestuous Earl of Warwick, knew instantly that this was a trap. It was not an invitation to consult, but a death warrant disguised as a royal command. If they attended, they would be arrested, tried for treason, and executed before the week was out. With the king's authority now being used to hunt them down, Richard of York did the only thing a man of his ambition and pride could do. He defied the crown and prepared for war. He gathered his forces and began a rapid march toward London, claiming, with dramatic sincerity, that he only sought to liberate the king from the evil counselors who held him captive. The truth, however, was written in the steel of their swords. Meanwhile, King Henry VI, weak and desperately reliant on his ministers, was escorted by the Duke of Somerset and the Duke of Buckingham to the small, unsuspecting market town of St. Albans, blocking York's route to the capital. The stage was set for the ultimate showdown. a clash of ideology, ambition, and pure, concentrated hatred. On May 22, 1455, the two small armies faced each other. York's forces were smaller, but they were highly trained and motivated. The king's side was poorly prepared, relying entirely on the sanctity of the royal banner to deter attack. York played the part of the devoted subject one last time, sending a solemn ultimatum across the lines: surrender the Duke of Somerset, the Earl of Northumberland, and Lord Clifford to stand trial for their purported crimes against the king. Surrender them, and the peace would be restored. King Henry VI, cornered and terrified but compelled by Somerset, refused absolutely, declaring that he would die with his standard raised before he would betray a single man who had come to defend him. That defiant, tragic refusal was the signal. The First Battle of St. Albans, the true opening shot of the Wars of the Roses, began with a rush. York's main force launched a heavy frontal assault against the flimsy town barricades, but the royal defenses held fast, raining arrows down onto the narrow streets. It looked, for a terrifying moment, as though York was destined for defeat, a quick, humiliating end to his rebellion. But the Yorkists possessed a secret weapon, a force of nature known as the Kingmaker. Chaos and immediate, absolute panic ensued. This was not a general melee. It was an assassination list being executed in real time. The Yorkist troops, knowing exactly who their targets were, ignored the foot soldiers and focused mercilessly on the Lancastrian commanders. In the span of just 2 hours, the Lancastrian command structure was utterly decapitated. 3 of the most powerful peers supporting Henry VI lay dead in the mud of St. Albans, proving that no title, no matter how ancient, offered protection from the White Rose's fury. Richard of York approached his captive king not as a rebel, but as a deliverer. He knelt, offered comfort, and escorted the bewildered king back to London, claiming once more that he had saved the monarch from the traitors who had sought to mislead him. Henry VI was now a puppet, dressed in royal regalia but dancing entirely to the tune of the White Rose. The fragile peace was shattered, replaced by an overwhelming, genetically coded demand for revenge. Queen Margaret, who had successfully fled the slaughter, vowed that the blood spilled on the cobblestones would be repaid 100-fold. The storm had broken, and now nothing would ever be the same. The silence following the clash at Northampton was the most terrifying sound England had ever heard. It was the sound of Queen Margaret, alone in the wilderness, mobilizing a primal, unrelenting storm that would soon engulf the entire kingdom in darkness. She had lost her court, her prestige, and nearly her son. But she still possessed the one thing Richard of York had forgotten: absolute, visceral hatred. Vengeance was not merely a political goal. It was the fuel of her entire existence now, burning hotter than any furnace. The northern lords, rugged and fiercely loyal to the principle of kingship, were always suspicious of the smooth-talking southerners and the overweening ambitions of the House of York. They viewed the Duke of York not as a savior, but as a usurper who had dared to touch the anointed, if incompetent, King Henry VI. Margaret exploited this deep-seated regional bias like a master puppeteer pulling threads of raw steel. She promised land, plunder, and the right to pillage the wealthy towns of the South, a devil's bargain that swelled her ranks with thousands of desperate, loyal, and terrifying men ready to march through ice and snow for her cause. This was not a professional army. This was a hungry, brutal horde, driven by poverty and the promise of rich spoils, utterly devoted to the fierce queen who dared to lead them. York had won the battle, but Margaret was about to win the war of psychology. Richard of York, meanwhile, had committed the cardinal sin of the victorious. He believed the conflict was over. Having seized the throne, or at least the right to succeed the catatonic King Henry, he retired to his ancestral stronghold, Sandal Castle, near Wakefield, to celebrate a premature Christmas. The Duke of York was a brilliant tactician of structured field battles, but he was slow to react to the irregular, almost guerrilla warfare that Margaret was now unleashing upon the north. His victory had made him blind to the real, existential threat still facing him. Margaret's army, a terrifying wall of steel and fury, descended upon Yorkshire with the speed of an avalanche, catching the Yorkist forces completely unprepared for the depth of winter campaigning. They were not playing by the rules of chivalry. They were seeking blood, cold and brutal, and they demanded immediate satisfaction. On December 30, 1460, Richard, against the desperate advice of his close advisers who smelled the sulfur of a trap, marched out of Sandal Castle. The Lancastrians, under the experienced leadership of the Duke of Somerset and the Earl of Northumberland, had perfected a feigned retreat so convincing it was a masterpiece of military deceit. York, seeing a smaller contingent, believed he could crush them quickly and secure his position for the winter, a fatal error fueled by arrogance and impatience. He saw an easy victory, but he was walking straight into a meticulously crafted execution chamber. What he failed to see, concealed deep in the woods and fog surrounding the battlefield, was the overwhelming majority of Margaret's army, waiting like hungry wolves hidden in the shadows. When the signal was given, the trap slammed shut with a deafening, terrifying finality. His severed head was finally mounted over the Micklegate bar in the city of York. The inscription below the gruesome trophy was a declaration of permanent war and an ultimate insult. Let York overlook York. That son was Edward, Earl of March, a man forged in the fires of battle and burning with the immediate, visceral need for total retribution. Edward was only 18, but he possessed everything his father had lacked: overwhelming charisma, natural military genius, and a terrifying ability to seize the moment. He was strikingly handsome, taller than any man in England, and utterly fearless, a true warrior king waiting to be crowned. While Margaret's northern army was busy looting their way south, leaving a trail of destruction that alienated every neutral party in its path, Edward was consolidating his power base in the Welsh marches. He gathered the remnants of the Yorkist cause, focusing their grief and terror into a single, terrifying weapon pointed straight at London. The common people, horrified by the unrestrained brutality of Margaret's northern horde, the pillaging, the lack of discipline, the sheer anarchy, began to turn against the Lancastrian cause entirely. They saw Edward not as a usurper, but as a deliverer from chaos. He was their shining white rose, promising order and swift justice. Edward's march south was rapid and disciplined, but Margaret was still intent on reaching London and seizing Henry VI from Yorkist custody before the city could rally. The forces met again at St. Albans, the very ground where the war had first erupted in a confused, bloody skirmish years earlier. This time, Margaret was absolutely triumphant. The Lancastrian forces, fighting with the fierce zeal of conquerors, completely routed the Yorkist army led by the Earl of Warwick, the legendary Kingmaker. Warwick, stunned and disgraced, was forced to abandon King Henry VI on the battlefield in his haste to escape the slaughter. The pathetic, mentally broken king was found wandering aimlessly under an oak tree, laughing nervously and oblivious as the battle raged around him. Margaret had her husband back. She had defeated Warwick. She had avenged Wakefield. The path to London lay open, a clear, undefended prize, ready to crown her victory and secure the future of her lineage. But vengeance is blind, and her victory at Second Albans would prove to be one of the greatest tactical blunders in English history, the critical moment where she snatched defeat from the jaws of absolute triumph. She hesitated, paralyzed by political indecision and the wild indiscipline of her northern troops who had turned the surrounding villages into a feeding ground of pillage and terror. London was terrified of the northern horde, and the gates remained slammed shut, refusing entry to the Queen's conquering army. Meanwhile, the young, magnificent Edward had combined his forces with the disgraced but powerful Warwick. They were marching on London with frightening speed, turning Margaret's moment of hesitation into the most costly delay of the entire war. The true Kingmaker was about to arrive. The silence that fell over the Tower of London was not one of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes the end of the world. Queen Margaret's gamble had failed. She had dithered, and that sliver of indecision was now a chasm swallowing her entire kingdom. The great gates of the city were not locked against the rebels. They were thrown wide open in a frenzy of desperate welcome. London, always the judge of kings, had delivered its verdict on the pathetic Lancastrian regime, cheering for the men who promised stability and an end to the endless French losses that plagued the merchants' coffers and the national pride. Lord Warwick, the Kingmaker, rode through the streets like a conquering emperor, his armor gleaming brighter than any crown. He didn't need to fight a battle. The battle had already been won in the hearts of the commoners and cemented by the crippling fear in the eyes of the royal counselors who dared to oppose him. The capital had fallen without a single drop of blood being shed by the invaders, a stunning psychological victory that neutralized Henry VI's already fragile authority. But Warwick was merely the architect of the moment. The true claimant, the man whose bloodline screamed legitimacy and whose ambition dwarfed all others, was waiting in the shadows: Richard, Duke of York. He arrived in London not as a supplicant or a disgruntled cousin begging for the protectorship, but as a king returning to claim his rightful inheritance, armed with generations of suppressed royal descent. York marched straight into Westminster Hall, the very heart of English governance, and committed an act of audacious treason that shocked the entire nation to its core. He did not kneel, he did not bow, but instead he laid his gauntleted hand directly upon the sacred, empty throne. The audacity, the sheer terrifying confidence of the act froze the entire chamber in a tableau of terrified silence. This was no petition for guardianship or protectorate. This was the direct, unforgiving theft of the sacred, anointed crown. The air crackled with the sheer weight of historical precedent being shattered. York did not whisper his claim, he roared it, detailing his descent from Lionel at Antwerp, an undeniable superior claim that rendered the current Lancastrian rule a constitutional fraud. He demanded the throne based on genetic destiny, detailing how the weak, tainted blood of the Beaufort line, stemming from the illegitimate ancestors of Henry IV, currently polluted the divine institution of the English monarchy. The lords, steeped in tradition and paralyzed by the fear of divine retribution, could not bring themselves to execute the sacred ritual of regicide. They feared deposing an anointed king, even one as useless and mad as Henry VI. They needed a loophole, a legalistic tragedy to avoid total, immediate civil war, even though the war had already begun. They desperately forged the Act of Accord, a document so fragile it was practically written in gunpowder, designed to satisfy York's pride while maintaining the illusion of stability. Richard of York was officially named the successor, the heir apparent, stepping over the legitimate Prince of Wales, as if he were a pebble in the road. This was the ultimate betrayal of the Lancastrian cause, signed and sealed by the weak hand of a compromised parliament. The White Rose had effectively won the succession without drawing the final bloody sword of full deposition. York, basking in the glow of his legal triumph, perhaps believed the war was over, that paper and parchment could settle a debt paid in blood. He thought the Queen would simply accept the disinheritance of her only child. He could not have been more catastrophically wrong about the nature of the woman he faced. But one person heard the news from the north, and the rage that erupted from her was hotter than the fires of hell. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the she-wolf of France, was watching her son's destiny being ripped away by men who feared her power, but not her fury. To disinherit her boy, her sweet, legitimate Prince Edward, was an insult that transcended mere politics. It was a physical threat to her own flesh and blood, a spiritual violation of her marriage. She would never accept this paper treaty. She would never allow York to stand between her line and the crown. The gloves were off, the pretenses dissolved into the freezing northern air. Margaret began a ferocious, scorched-earth campaign of recruitment in the Lancastrian strongholds, promising land, plunder, and vengeance against the soft southern lords who had stolen her son's future. She was not fighting for Henry's crown anymore. She was fighting for her son's survival and the very future of the House of Lancaster, fueled by an unstoppable, primal, maternal rage. York thought he had won a settlement. He had only purchased his own execution and guaranteed the resumption of true warfare. Richard of York, perhaps blinded by his sudden, bloodless legal victory, utterly underestimated the raw, corrosive fury he had unleashed. He assumed Margaret would abide by the legal framework of Parliament, a fatal, tragic miscalculation. Margaret understood only one law, the law of the sword and the law of a mother protecting her cub. Realizing the danger too late, York and his key ally Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, Warwick's father, hastily gathered their forces and marched north, determined to squash this resurgence before the winter fully set in. They moved toward York's great stronghold, Sandal Castle, near Wakefield, believing that fortress would keep them safe. The stage was set for the bloodiest Christmas England had ever known, a battle that would decide not just who reigned, but whether the House of York could survive the holiday season. Margaret was coming, and she demanded the head of the man who dared disinherit her son and challenged the legitimacy of the entire Lancastrian dynasty. The calendar had flipped to December 1460, but Margaret of Anjou wasn't preparing for Christmas cheer. She was preparing for total annihilation. The moment Richard of York, through the deeply insulting Act of Accord, declared himself protector and heir to the throne, he had signed his own death warrant in the furious blood of the Lancastrian line. Margaret, fueled by the sheer, terrifying force of maternal rage, had mobilized every displaced lord, every mercenary, and every northern partisan who still believed in the divine right of her poor, broken husband, Henry VI. She was no longer a queen seeking diplomacy. She was a terrifying stormfront, leading an army south that swore allegiance not to the crown, but solely to her relentless vengeance. She had tasted humiliation in London, watched the White Rose usurp her son's future, and now she demanded the highest price for that arrogance, the head of the Duke of York himself. Richard knew she was coming, but perhaps the brief taste of near kingship had dulled his legendary caution, leading him to commit the single greatest tactical blunder of his formidable career. Richard had retreated to his estates near Wakefield, occupying the formidable, thick-walled strength of Sandal Castle. It was a position designed to withstand a prolonged siege, exactly what the biting cold winter demanded. Margaret's northern army was vast, but notoriously ill-disciplined, largely comprised of desperate men seeking plunder, not professional soldiers eager for a lengthy, cold winter siege. York had provisions, he had high walls, he had every advantage required to wait out the inevitable dissipation of a restless, starving mob. Yet, on December 30th, 1460, just days after the celebration of the Nativity, something snapped. Was it a fundamental failure of intelligence? Was it simple overriding pride? Was it the deep, fatal arrogance that the Lancastrian rabble would surely crumble the moment he showed his famous face? Whatever the disastrous reason, Richard of York made the inexplicable decision to leave the safety of his impregnable walls and meet the enemy in open battle on the frozen field below. It remains one of the most staggering acts of self-destruction in English military history, a move of utter fatal confidence that betrayed everything the shrewd Duke stood for. He led a force of perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 men out onto the icy fields, convinced he was marching toward a decisive victory, but in reality, he was marching directly into a perfectly executed trap orchestrated with chilling precision by Margaret's lieutenants, the Duke of Somerset and the savage Lord Clifford. The Lancastrians were masters of deception that frigid morning. While one large force positioned itself visibly, drawing York's smaller army forward into a premature engagement, the main body of Margaret's host, numbering perhaps 8,000 men, lay perfectly hidden in the surrounding woods and low ground, masked by the winter mist and terrain. It was the classic pincer movement, brutal and absolutely flawless. York's army charged forward, believing they were engaging the entirety of the enemy presence, only to suddenly find themselves surrounded, trapped, and utterly overwhelmed by sheer numbers pouring out from behind them and from the flanks, cutting off any route of retreat back to the safety of Sandal Castle. But courage meant nothing against the suffocating, overwhelming tide of Lancastrian steel. He was cut down, probably fighting to the very last breath. His entire lineage of ambition and his glorious White Rose shattered on the bloody, icy ground of Wakefield Moor. The news raced across England like wildfire. York was dead. The Act of Accord was meaningless. The House of Lancaster had returned to its violent, terrifying senses. While Margaret rampaged through the north, her path marked by the looting and destruction that quickly alienated even neutral citizens, the mantle of the White Rose did not fall to the ground and disappear. It fell instead to the eldest surviving son of Richard of York, Edward, Earl of March, a formidable, charismatic, and ruthlessly effective figure who was only 18 years old. Edward was already demonstrating the natural military genius his father had sometimes fatally lacked. He was in the West Country when the news arrived, not of mere defeat, but of his father's utter annihilation and his younger brother's cold-blooded murder and mutilation. The grief was real, but the resulting resolve was absolute and chillingly focused. The stage was now set for the next terrifying act of this epic, the unstoppable rise of the glorious sun and splendor. The year 1455 was not merely a date on a calendar. It was the year the floodgates finally burst open, unleashing a torrent of noble blood that would stain the English soil for generations. Richard, Duke of York, had tasted power during his brief protectorship and found it intoxicating, far sweeter than the Irish governorship he had been assigned. Queen Margaret, the Lioness of Anjou, knew that as long as York breathed free air, her son, Prince Edward, lived under a constant, lethal shadow. Their political maneuvering had reached a horrifying impasse, and the solution, as always in this broken age, lay only in steel and slaughter. The clash came violently at the First Battle of St. Albans, a seemingly minor skirmish in the grand scheme of the Wars of the Roses, yet monumental in its consequence. On May 22, 1455, the Yorkist faction, driven by the relentless political hunger of Richard of York and, crucially, the newly prominent, outrageously wealthy, and ferociously ambitious Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, descended upon the Lancastrian camp. King Henry VI, momentarily lucid but utterly useless, sat trapped within the town, a pathetic figurehead begging his men not to fight, only to be utterly ignored by the very people sworn to protect him. Warwick, the man history would forever remember as the kingmaker, displayed the military genius that would define the next decade of warfare. While the main forces engaged in a grim deadlock, Warwick brilliantly led a small detachment through gardens and back alleys, smashing through the hastily erected defenses and bursting into the marketplace where the king's retinue huddled. The people cheered, utterly oblivious to the fact that the man they cheered had just committed high treason and murdered the king's ministers. Richard of York resumed his role as protector, and for 4 excruciatingly tense years, a toxic, fragile peace settled over England.